has been, arguably.
Not so, because...
You're talking about the extent, or you're talking about a new phenomenon?
Well, I mean, it is when Chandrika Kumartunga appointed Mr. Sunil Mendis from outside the system. I don't know whether it was, you could call it a political appointment, but it was the first time it broke away from the tradition of having a senior official rise through the bank, or an economist brought from the treasury run the central bank, because this is a very technical
institution.
Yes. And of course, after that, the current incumbent was also appointed by the president. Now, if you go a little further, the monetary board is what really is the board of directors, quote unquote, of the central bank. Now, according to law, 3 out of the 5 members must be appointed with the concurrence of the Constitutional Council.
Which of course doesn't exist.
Which of course doesn't exist. So what we have now, the almost, I think, 4 out of the 5 members, 2 ex officio and 2 out of the 3 independent so-called members, have just been appointed by the government. So the issue is, what is the capacity of both the monetary board and the decision makers in order to carry out what needs to be done.
But if I am to understand you correctly, the politicization, the party politicization began with the former president, and what you are suggesting now is that it is of a nature so corrosive that it has overwhelmed the independence of the institution?
That is, yeah, essentially that's what I'm trying to say. Because see, if you look at the central bank, the technical capabilities of the people at the central bank, it is absolutely the number one. I mean, you don't have, you look at the number of PhDs that sit in that central bank. I mean, I know many of them. I have the utmost respect for the people, the technocrats at the central bank. So it is very difficult to understand how such people would not see that we are going down the wrong path. It's unbelievable. So therefore, one has to wonder, whether the technical advice is being, taken into consideration or not.
I have a couple of follow-up questions. One is that we are in the process of negotiating now this instrument called a bailout or help, whatever you might call it. Do we know what exactly this instrument is?
Well, yes. Those days it was very cut and dry. You go to the IMF and they bail you out. It's essentially for balance of payments.
It's a balance of payment instrument.
That's right.
Right.
To support the balance of payments.
But my follow-up question, this cannot be used then for, say, post-LTT or post-conflict?
No, not at all.
Right.
Absolutely
could
not.
Could mission creep in, and then could it be used for that, or would that be in violation of the conditions?
No, that would be in violation of the conditions. You cannot use that. I mean, this is not like a development loan that you would get from the World Bank.
As opposed to some of the spin that we've been reading.
Yes, this is the irony of the whole thing. We are told, look, this is for Northeast reconstruction. Not so. Not so. This is purely to support us from, you try to pull us out from the hole we've fallen into, so that Sri Lanka will not default. I mean, you see, for the 61 years, we proudly say we have never defaulted anyone, and that is the truth. But we are now on the verge of default. So that is why we have asked for this bailout, so that we will not default.
In the thrust and parry, in the tug and pull of negotiating this, one could argue, and the argument has been made also, that the IMF has a vested interest in seeing Sri Lanka not be a defaulter. And so that the conditionalities it imposes, and there will be conditionalities, I would imagine, would not be that too harsh. Because at the end of the day, the IMF wants a good customer, if you want, out of Sri Lanka. Now, how does that play out? I mean,
Yeah, is that not necessarily money to the IMF that we may or may not default, but we have roughly 12 to 13 billion dollars of external debt, and things become, amounts become due,
sure,
and we got to pay them. Particularly in the last 2 to 3 years, we have been going to the commercial markets. As we all know, we've been selling all kinds of short-term instruments, getting money at fairly high rates of interest in the commercial marketplace, and these are coming due, and we have to pay these back. And if we default as a country, that will have terrible repercussions across the board. I mean, commercial entities will not be able to raise money that is required. LCs may not be honored, and so on. So, I mean, the reason why IMF usually bails countries out so that they won't default is not for their personal interest,
sure,
but interest of the country. So this is, I think we need to make a distinction as to, with this money is for a government or this money is for the people of this country. So if you look at it from that point, I would argue that some of these conditionalities they will impose. Sure, they are going to be.
Absolutely. And what do you think?
Those conditionalities would hopefully help Sri Lanka maintain sufficient reserves and enough dollars to pay back what is going to be due in the short term. Now you're asking me what the conditionalities are. This is the million-dollar question. Right? IMF has never in its history given any money to any country without any conditions. Having said that, it may be the first time they do it.
Okay.
In given this current condition,
sure,
they will give money without conditions for countries who have maintained a good macroeconomic record. The countries with small deficits, countries with floating exchange rates, countries where governments don't waste money on unproductive programs, and countries that have been affected purely because of the global financial situation. So a country like Singapore would then get lumped into that group of countries. Now Sri Lanka definitely does not
fall into that category. But what really can we expect for the citizen? I mean, not necessarily the investor.
Right. So really, it's interesting series of events that took place, because IMF was here on what they call the Article 4 consultations, third quarter of last year, and they produced a report. Funnily, that report was never published. The IMF usually gives it to the government with the implicit assumption that it will get published. So we as the public haven't seen this, but there has been a summary that has been published, and the summary talks of imprudent fiscal policy, not good exchange rate management, loose monetary policy leading to very, very high levels of inflation, fiscal expenditure that is unsustainable. So I would argue that the position since then and now have, it's actually gotten worse.
Right.
It's actually gotten worse. So the quote-unquote conditions would essentially then be to deal with the issues that have been identified in this secret report that sits in the central bank.